killing me, Smalls.
To infinity and beyond!
What the what?
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the What the What podcast. I am your host, Eric Creech. Joining me today, Kyle Whitley, Ashby Brame. What's up, guys? How y'all doing tonight?
Great.
Feeling good. I'm feeling
Just
pretty good.
Enjoying this intro.
I'm just really feeling this music.
Yeah.
Honestly.
It's good stuff. It's good stuff.
I feel like I need some cereal, some orange juice, some jammies.
This would come on the Fox Kids Network, what,
Needs to
11
be
o'clock
Saturday
on Saturday
morning.
mornings?
Oh, yeah.
11:30. It was like one of the
Fox
last episodes
Kids.
before you
Soul
got
Train.
Soul Train.
Yeah.
At noon.
Kids will never understand that.
No.
It's like, what do you mean Soul Train? It's like, well, that's when we knew it was time to do something else. Like,
That's right. That's when cartoons were over.
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to get
Time to go
DMCA for
outside
that
until
song,
the
I think.
streetlights come on.
Yeah. Yep.
Wow, what an intro. Like I was just saying, we're going to get DMCA'd for that. And probably our last episode, too. But you know what? This is 2022. We're taking risk.
Look, if the
our
Looper
you-
Knoll wants
our-
to come after us,
If our YouTube videos get banned in North Korea again, so be it.
that is a price we are willing to
If
pay.
Kuwait doesn't want to listen to us anymore because we, played some songs,
Well, that's Kuwait's loss.
that's their loss.
If they don't want to listen to X-Men, they got other problems to deal with.
Oh my goodness. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. This is our second episode of the 9 on the 90s season.
90s on 9.
No.
90s. What a rush.
Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever it is you get your podcast. And of course, rate and review us. We accept 5-star ratings, preferably only. There is a
We're not gonna
renegade
talk
out
about
there.
that
We're
one
not going to talk about him.
Anonymous person. Could be a her.
Coward.
Could be anything.
Show your face.
Yeah.
It's probably someone we know, and they're listening to this season. They're like, wow, they really did not like that.
We know it was you, Hunter Baden.
Chris Strode, I haven't
He's
heard from
finally
you in a
paying
while.
us back for knocking out Lego in the first round of
That's
the Greatest
true.
12
That's what it
tournament.
was. He was like, oh, 3
Whatever
stars.
happened to Chris Rode?
He started running like Forrest Gump, and then he's just been running ever since.
Tell him to listen to some podcasts
Although,
on his runs.
To be fair, he did decide to label, because, I'm a marketing person. I love a good, ploy. He labels all of his running posts with Roadrunner, #Roadrunner,
Yes.
but how he spells his last name with an
Marketing.
H.
I love it.
Amazing.
Nailed it.
I love it. It's like when my brother got married and their hashtag was get your creech on.
Wow. Wow. Okay. I love it, actually.
Oh, my
Since
goodness.
you've got big things to conquer.
Yeah.
You better be thinking before you ever get married.
I know,
if
right?
your brother already used that one, I don't know what you got.
I don't know what we'll have to really brainstorm this at some point.
I got
maybe
you.
maybe
I got
soon.
you.
We'll see. You're a marketing genius.
Yeah, I'll come up with it.
You're in marketing, at least.
Wow. Okay.
Oh,
Cool.
You're a genius.
Thank
she's
you.
like, okay, get out of my house,
Thank
Kyle, and I
you.
will finish this episode.
Get my name out your mouth.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please also follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram at What the What Media.
All one word, I think.
Wow.
And we're also on Twitter at WTW_media. Again, second episode of the 9 on the 90s season. Go check out the previous episode, the 90s mixtape. Also check out our previous season, the holiday season last fall, and the 100 episodes that preceded that season as well. A lot of great stuff in the 90s seasons coming up, but today we are talking about one of the, when you think of like superhero fandoms, I think those of us who were born in the mid to late 80s, one of our first experiences with superheroes was this television show as kids. It was the X-Men animated series that came out in 1992. Let's talk about X-Men. Let's talk about our memories of this and or our connections with this series and how it shaped our fandom in the superhero genre.
I changed my mind. I just had a thought that instead of cereal, to make it really thematic, what I actually need is one of those wild berry Pop-Tarts with like the bright green icing that went on top. That would make it perfect.
I also need one of those juices that were in the bottle, like that had a face on it. I don't remember what they were. Do you remember those? Or maybe I was just
I know,
a spoiled child in me.
no. I know what you're talking
The
about.
commercials that like they were characters, but
You
on the
talking about
bottles.
the easy
I want to say
squeezes?
something like
Maybe.
Gushers or something.
It reminds me of Gushers, but
Yeah.
like I told Eric about it the other day, and I couldn't remember what it was. Is it Easy Squeeze?
Easy squeeze.
Hold on, folks. While we're out there,
We're live Googling doing
this
our
is
own,
more important than X-Men right now.
our own half-baked internet research here.
90s bottle with faces. Let's see.
What were they called?
This is very Squeeze It.
Squeeze it.
Squeeze
Squeeze
it.
it.
I was
There
gonna say,
you
I remember
go.
Mondo Juice,
Yeah, that was
but
different.
they came
Mondo Juice.
after Squeeze Its.
Yep. So we're going to grab a Squeeze It. Hopefully a happy looking one. Yep, there he is.
No sugar in that at all.
No.
This was
Most
Chucklin'
importantly.
Cherry. Chucklin' Cherry.
Well, it depends if we're watching this on a Saturday morning or we're watching a rerun, like, on like a week afternoon. Grab a Surge. Sit down and have a good
Surge, yeah.
time.
Go ahead and
Wow.
get your
Some
caffeine intake.
Dunkaroos. Again,
Dunkaroos.
no
Dunkaroos,
sugar.
none.
Don't worry about it.
Wow. So X-Men.
Yeah. Anybody want to start?
I'll start because mine are a little bit more general than you two's. I was watching a lot of things as a kid that I wasn't necessarily absorbing just because Scooby-Doo really stuck for me because that was probably the early inclination that I was going to be really into like mystery, thriller, that kind of thing. But obviously Scooby-Doo wasn't the only thing on TV. And so everything else was kind of this like massive amalgamation in my head of just like pop culture in my face. And so I remember I'd wake up, I'd go wake up my dad because I knew better than to wake up my mom. And I'd tell him I was awake. And he would say, at a certain age, you can kind of get stuff for yourself. So he would say, okay, I'll be there in a minute, like whatever. And so I'd go get, something to drink out of the fridge and I'd wait for him to make me breakfast and I would turn on the TV and I would just watch like whatever was on and whatever channel I could get it to. And so sometimes that was Fox Kids in the morning and it would be X-Men. And then, I wasn't really keeping up with the channel, right? Like what belonged on what channel. Like I didn't know where to go find things like, oh, it's 8:30, which means Doug is on this channel.
Yep.
I would just flip until I saw stuff. So it was like Scooby-Doo, X-Men, like Rescue Rangers, Johnny Quest, because there was like all the
Bobby's
Hanna-Barbera
World.
stuff. And
Beetlejuice was on at the same time, too. in
right.
That morning
And
show.
so I do remember X-Men breaking through the static a little bit just because that was probably as the first. So I was the first child and I was a girl. So I didn't have older brothers who were informing anything. And I was young enough that I wasn't really going to school yet or like hanging out with boys. And so I had no concept of like superheroes and stuff that was being marketed to boy kids. And so seeing this cartoon was probably the first time that I was like, whoa, superheroes.
Yeah.
And it was just fortunate that it happened to include women,
sure.
right?
Yes.
So it wasn't like, probably Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a close second of like having some kind of like crime fighting situation that I could watch. But I definitely didn't have any MCU, like there wasn't anything on the Marvel characters at that time. Fox had really gone into animation, I think, more so, and started marketing to kids. And so the X-Men was the first time that I had really had any kind of idea that like there were superheroes, there were groups of superheroes, there were women superheroes. This was the first time that I was around, like was thinking about like Storm and like the idea that you could have powers around weather, like that was fascinating to me. So I don't really remember episodes, storylines. I just remember sort of like absorbing the X-Men canon through watching this show, like the idea that there was a school and Professor Xavier. So then when I'm older and the live action movies come around, I have a basis for like the concept of what I'm about to watch, whereas otherwise I would have had no idea.
So for me, X-Men existed in this world where you had the big three in 90s animation. You had X-Men, you had Batman, you had Spider-Man. They were highest quality, best storylines, and they still hold up to this day. X-Men was it was one of those shows where it had colorful characters in terms of costumes, in terms of diverse powers, in terms of great stories. It also, as it was marketed, it also crossed over into the toy realm where you'd see these toys out there that would, you'd see the show, you see the toys. These shows were mainly designed to sell toys. And then you go to Hoot Willoughby's and you see the X-Men arcade, and all these worlds kind of collide around the same time in the early to mid 90s. And it's just, you see that it's like this rush of colors, this rush of, special effects and cool things happening. And it's the same effect that Power Rangers had, where you have, again, a rush of different colors and, different costume superheroes, and they each have a dinosaur, and dinosaurs are cool because, Jurassic Park and blah, blah, blah. And, you're overwhelmed by all that you're taking in. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, which powers would I want? Would I want to be Cyclops and shoot the cool little laser beams? Would I want Wolverines and have the claws? I wouldn't want to be Beast. He doesn't have powers. But he does. Would you want to be Storm? Like, that was a consideration. Storm had the coolest powers. Rogue had the coolest powers. She could fly and, it's just
zap people's
strength.
Yeah.
And so, like, that was the real big stick out for me. It was an introduction to what has turned into a lifelong fandom of all things superhero related. Seeing this show, it was the start of something wonderful in my life, and being able to connect it all back to this one show is really cool to me.
Something beyond just what you guys have said, is because it's 100% the same way for me. It was a big introduction. Like, I was a giant Ninja Turtles fan, so superheroes were all about what I loved. Batman the Animated Series came out around the same time period, and it was very much the same type of show, where it was more not just little kid type show, it was also adults. But something that's always stood out to me is, again, it's marketing, but Pizza Hut back in the day used to have a lot of tie-ins to kids type things. I remember like the Land Before Time puppets, which I think was Pizza Hut, but I also know that Casper had puppets that, like, you buy a pizza and you spend so many dollars, you can get this puppet or whatever. They did that with a lot of things. They also had this tie-in with X-Men, the animated series. I think it was 93 when they first did it, but what's the first two episodes? The Night of the Sentinels?
Night of the Sentinels, yes.
There's part 1 and part 2, which was the first released episodes of the television show ever. Well, when you went to Pizza Hut, if you bought a pizza for $4.99, you could also get a VHS tape, which was that episode. You also got the two parts as a whole. You also got a trading card with part of the original X-Men characters, or at least from the show, on the card. You got a poster, and I think that's it. But
that's an amazing deal, though. Why don't we have deals like that now?
For sure. Like, so I remember having that. They also, I think it was 2 parts. They had this one, and then they had one that was the second episode of, like, about Magneto. I don't remember what it was called. But the same way, something that was really neat, that as I've gotten older, I've gone back and watched because it's really cool to see. But before the episodes air, it's not just a straight VHS. They have a round table, and I think they called it, let me get back to my notes real quick, because I want to make sure I list all these people correctly.
Wait, are X-Men Marvel?
Yeah.
Yes.
Did you not know that?
Why did I think they were DC? Maybe because they were on Fox at the time?
Well, it was during the time, too, it's like later seasons of X-Men animated series, is whenever Marvel was going bankrupt and selling off everything.
Maybe I thought they were DC because they're still not really under the MCU umbrella because they were sold.
They are now.
But they are now.
They are now.
Disney has bought them.
Because Disney bought them back.
Mm-hmm.
But for a long time, like, the movies that were put out were separate from what was going on.
Just like
Fantastic
Spider-Man
Four.
and
Right, with Sony. Okay.
Fantastic Four, Daredevil originally, Blade.
Right.
Because back then, when Marvel was going bankrupt, they were selling off the rights to these characters to try to, like, stay afloat somewhat.
Gotcha. Okay.
But they called it Creator's Choice. So there's a round table before this episode starts, about like 5-6 minutes. But it's Stan Lee, Scott Lobel, Fabian Necieza, I believe, and Bob Harris, which were different comic creators or on current books, different things. Obviously, Stan Lee being who he is. But as a child, I had no clue Stan Lee was, because as we talked about,
Of course.
I didn't know much about comics. I knew they existed. I'd seen them every once in a while, and I was like, recognize different characters. But for a lot of us, this was our introduction into comic book characters. This wasn't something that, unless you had somebody in your family that, gave you comics or liked comics themselves, this wasn't something that, you looked at often.
I would have had no concept that they were comic characters. Yeah. I would have thought I was just watching like something like Captain Planet, or
for sure
that was just made up.
And for me, later seeing comic books, I was like, oh, cool, they made books after the show I like to watch, not the reverse of it.
Right.
But before this episode, it's really cool. You can find these on YouTube. There's 2 separate ones because of the 2 different VHSs. And again, it's only like 5-6 minutes. But they're talking to Stan Lee. They're all talking to each other. And he's talking about the X-Men and about creating this group of characters. And they were like, we've got Spider-Man and we've got this. And, they got bit by bugs. They got radioactive. Like he said, but we decided to come up with a group of people that were just born that way. And they were mutants and they were different. And, it was a big ordeal to come up with a group of people like that, minorities and everything else. And there was a lot of underlying tones of these characters that were going on in the real world. And so they created this group. So he talks about that a little bit. He also talks about deciding on the powers and like who gets what. And they literally, it's just like, everybody likes to fly, so it'd be cool to like to fly. And so they gave this character this, and they gave, different ones and like lasers out of your eyes and different stuff. And they even briefly mentions too about like, it's not just great, easy things. It's some powers that people struggle with in the midst of having these powers. But I 100% recommend going and watching it. It's a much younger Stan Lee than what we're used to seeing in cameos from the MCU. And until this, like, I didn't have a clue Stan Lee was. Like, it was years later, now that Marvel movies had come out, I'd gotten into comic books and gotten into digging into things that I was like, wait a second, that guy that I was used to, like, he voiced Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends every once in a while. He would do like a voiceover or whatever. But I had no clue Stan Lee was. So to go back now and to watch it, it's really neat. But then they also play those episodes. And I remember, you're at home back in the day. Nickelodeon and Disney were starting, especially around that time, where you had access to cartoons all day if you had cable. But, this wasn't a time where there was constantly cartoons on TV all the time. So a lot of times you would watch your VHSs over and over. And so I would watch this episode, or 2 technically combined, over and over and over again. And I remember it standing out. I remember the very first episode, or technically it's the second part of it, Morph dies. Like literally in a cartoon for kids to watch, one of your main characters you've been introduced is killed right in the first thing. And it's like, they wouldn't do that today. Like, I'm sure maybe they would on different whatever series, but I remember liking him. I remember not having any clue, like doing more research later, like Morph wasn't a character before. I think the Changeling or something was a previous thing. DC owned the rights to it, but he ended up coming along. And they're like, okay, we're going to create this guy Morph, put him in here. And it was neat to see where this is a guy that can pretty much mutate and change in anybody. Like, and kind of, I don't know if he necessarily got their powers, but it at least looked like them. And so they did a little bit of a jokes here and there where he imitated like the president or whatever, sitting on a couch and laughing at himself and calling himself an idiot or something like that. But all of a sudden you see this, and within the first 2 like whole episode, Morph dies. Wolverine, they have to leave them behind. They leave Beast behind too, or Beast ends up in jail. And the only reason he's going to jail is because he's different.
Right.
And so all this happens, and you see remorse from Wolverine, who's also, they get back to base, and he's mad because you've left my friend.
Right.
He's dead. We left him there. What kind of people are we? And I say all this, which sounds like some big, gigantic movie, and it's a cartoon on Saturday mornings for kids. And I think
it was pretty intense.
It was, and like a line that stands out to me forever is when they're going, I guess, back to the lab to destroy everything, and the Sentinels are these giant robot things, and there's a scene where Wolverine's on the back of the neck of one, and he screams like with passion, like, "This one's for you, Morph!" And he like cuts the head off, like goes to town, tearing into this giant robot. And, like, for me, like, that stands out now. Like, I watched the clip today, and you almost get a little, like, not necessarily teary-eyed, but a little bit in the heart about watching this thing to be like, I was a kid, and I understood that, a connection a little bit.
And they came out the gate.
Sure.
These 2 first episodes with pretty adult themes for a kids cartoon, you know, like the idea that, you know, all these superheroes don't necessarily get along. Like they're already setting up this sort of tension between Cyclops and Wolverine. And that seems to be canon to a certain extent throughout the different mediums of X-Men, that they just don't get along. They end up at odds a lot over Jean Grey, I think. You know, and that they're just sort of like flawed people who happen to have been born with these mutant powers, and that they are committed to doing good things with them and protecting other mutants from people who would want to harm them. But that they're also like very much adults, right?
Sure.
So like, even though it's a kid's cartoon, there's flirtation and there's violence, and Wolverine's still Wolverine, right? Like he's very gruff. Like none of these characters are really like fluffy. Like Rogue talks off the gate about like coming into her mutant power, about kissing a boy and almost killing him, you know? And so I guess I always thought, well, the live action movies are for adults where things get more adultier, and the cartoons are for kids. But this cartoon is it has very adult themes, you know, and it's not inappropriate, I don't think, but it's definitely not pulling its punches like, oh, we have to talk down to these kids. So, like, it's just the X-Men.
So, some of the social issues it deals with includes divorce, Christianity, the Holocaust, AIDS, hysteria, and feelings of loneliness. I mean, those are just some of the things that you see on this kids show alone. So definitely, I mean, I would say ahead of its time,
right?
In terms of, like, I guess not dumbing it down for their target audience. But I don't even think you'd see something like that today, honestly.
I don't think, especially so much topics, because even the same first episode, you're introduced to the most age close to we are is Jubilee, who's a teenager,
right?
Who is starting to have these powers that she has no control over. It's just starting to happen. It's like she shoots energy or sparks out of her hands or whatever. She's been given up as a child because she was different, or, you know, that's the vibe you get at least out of it. She's in foster care, or, you know, with foster parents. And what they're doing is they're scared for her. Like, so it's not that they don't like her. They care for her. But they're also contacting this, like, military guy to come take her because they think this is what's best. We don't know what to do with her.
Right.
And so that's where the whole, like, premise of the episode goes off, where this giant, like, robot that's taller than buildings, like a skyscraper, comes up, identifies her in a file built into itself to say, target her. And it's trying to kidnap this girl and take her to this thing because she has powers. Like, I was listening to a lot of podcasts today with just different writers or creators and stuff from this, just to kind of get a background idea, because I never dug into it. Like, I definitely think, you know, it's still good for the most part. But they did talk about where Stan Lee had created a lot of these characters, but other people had written and drawn them years since, like since the 70s or whatever, from beyond that. These characters had matured and grown up a whole lot from what the X-Men originally were. And Stan Lee very much still had, like, you know, a supervisor type role in this, where he came in and expressed concerns and talked about things. And he came into thinking, like, this is very much similar to how Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends were, where each episode I'm going to do a little mic thing where I talk about the things that we learned on this type of episode and the story arc and different things. And they kind of had explained to him, like, this is a lot more adult themed than like a little kiddie show that we're used to. And what I did here too is, like, they brought in the writers for this show, and the same thing happened with Batman the Animated Series, and we're very much out the gate like, this is what we want. We want it to be more adult themed, to like older kids, adults, to have these themes to conquer these type of conversations and these situations. And so they knew where they were heading right out the gate with this, versus there was some pushback with stuff. I wanted to look up, let me see her name. I did have it a minute ago. The executive,
Margaret Loesch. Yes.
She pushed for it really hard. They had already had like a pilot of a show that we're going to call Pride of the X-Men in '89, which was based around like Kitty Pryde. And it didn't go over and it didn't get made. Well, she ends up becoming the head of Fox Children's Network and immediately says, okay, great, we're making a comic on, or a cartoon on the X-Men. And you said something earlier, Ashby, too, about a lot of female characters in this TV show. And, you know, from us growing up, too, like the closest other thing you had was Power Rangers. Like, you either had the yellow or pink ranger, and it was just like, that was your options. But on this show, even in these first episode or two, there's multiple scenes where like the main cast is like 3 of the superheroes that are women and 1 guy maybe. Like it wasn't all guys and maybe 1 lady in the back kind of doing whatever.
And the women are kind of in charge.
For sure.
You know, like Storm's like, this is what we're doing. And Rogue's like, I'm going over there. You get behind me. Like it wasn't, it was never even like the guys are in charge or that.
Well, the guys were too busy bickering and fighting.
Right. It definitely is kind of like the guys are like the kids that the women have to be like, act right. Like, come on, we got stuff to do today, you know?
Yeah.
It was just really interesting that like out of the gate without any sort of exposition, it's like these girls are like doing it, like getting it done. And the guys are kind of like just bickering in the corner. And it was just really interesting to me that that was happening in the early 90s. You know, I feel like this is in a lot of ways ahead of its time in that sense. And we also talk about like not, like I mentioned it before, not talking down to kids. I think that there were some people who were ahead of their time in the sense that like they understood that children can process a more nuanced message more sometimes than we give them credit for. And I just thought it was really interesting that I think this show, maybe even Captain Planet to a certain extent, you know, you're not talking to kids like they're dumb. You're talking to kids like they're small adults, right? That can understand nuance. And so I thought that was really interesting, you know, because at some point in your life, you know, you go to bed and it's all Barney and Blue's Clues, and you wake up and you've just evolved from that. Like, that's dumb or whatever. And you need more nuance, but you're also not allowed to watch, like, Nash Bridges and Party of Five or whatever with your older sibling or your adults, because your parents, because that's too adult, right? And so I think in the 90s, there were networks who were understanding this, like, liminal space for kids who were our age in the mid-90s that needed some kind of transitionary entertainment. Like, don't treat us like we're dumb.
Sure.
But we also probably don't need to be seeing, like, gun violence.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's the same way they get away with things where you can't go rip somebody's arm off.
Right.
But when you put these giant robots in, you can. And there's not an issue with that.
Right, because they're not human.
Yeah, and it's, you know, and they're very much obvious it's not a human, so they're able to do these things. But even think, like, at this time we were 5, 6, 7, like around that age for each of us when this first came out. So to think around that age and a little bit more, but it's not that it evolved into this. We're talking about the first episode is right out the gate.
It was nuts to me that I was watching the first 2 episodes of the first season of this show. Like, it was very much in media rot. Like, I was like, I almost had to go back and look to make sure I clicked on the right thing, because it felt like the 2-part season finale of like a season 3.
Yeah.
Like, it was just like, and we're in the middle of the story.
Yeah.
Like, they formed, there's rules, there's all this stuff that, like, we'll get to that later. Right now, we're just in the middle of it.
And there's so much that typically wouldn't. Most shows would try to start you off with, here's this and here's that. And something that's cool to see, we talked about the writing a little bit, is some of these writers came from your typical Disney afternoon characters. Like, they were writing Chippendale Rescue Rangers. They were writing Tailspin. They were writing a lot of these things that we love too. Like, I'm not dashing any of that, but for sure. But it came from that type of environment to these writers got brought into, okay, this is your previous work. This is what this is.
Right.
And to know that, honestly, it's kind of for that whole same age group. Like, we would watch this and then watch Tailspin in the afternoons.
Right.
Something else that evolved with this, and, you know, Eric's talked about you, is the toys that came out of this. This was huge in general for these toys that came out. But something that stands on my mind is all these years later, when Avengers started taking place, and we live in this world now that superheroes aren't just, you know, for kids anymore. It's for everybody. It's okay to like superheroes. There was still a big issue where the only person you really had was kind of Black Widow, and they were very hesitant to put out any like toys or merch or anything for her. There was a big issue that got brought up in the news and it got brought up here and there. Versus back then, they were making Storm action figures. They made Rogue action figures.
Right.
And as a boy, I wanted them, like, because they're part of this cast. It doesn't matter what they are.
Right.
Like,
it's not like, oh, well, they're girls.
Yeah.
Like, and again, that's where I feel like we don't credit kids enough, right?
For sure.
You know? Like, boys aren't going to want girl superhero action figures where they're not thinking that they're girls.
No,
they're
we
thinking
needed Storm.
That,
Like,
she's amazing and can control the weather, and she's one of the key components. You can't have the set without her.
100%. And so, and I think that's part of that I love too, is because, again, we've talked about it before, but like, I grew up with a best friend, that was a girl, and you wanted to be able to do these things and like enjoy these type of things together. I say that as an adult now, deeply thinking about it, but as a kid, I didn't. We just like, this is who I'm going to be. I'm going to be this or this, or we're going to play this. And like, I don't know. It's just so cool to me to see, like, even then as kids, we were able to break through and be like, no, you can make tons of these characters. And then all these years later, there was still somewhat of an issue of, maybe don't make these toys.
I had a huge crush on Gambit.
Yeah.
And I would throw my dad's playing cards around the living room. Like,
100%.
I can do this, like that's basically what he's doing. They didn't explode, unfortunately.
I think that's a good...
In my mind, they did.
I think that's a good transition to some of our superlatives. Favorite character?
Gambit, obviously, in any incarnation. Like Taylor Kish, animated, I don't care. The accent, the whole package, the kinetic energy thing, it's all hot, super hot. It was hot when I was 7, it's still hot. I don't care.
Well, I love the fact you have Gambit, like, he wasn't your super obvious superhero character. None of these are, honestly. Some of them are different, but like...
Gambit is definitely, you don't realize it when you're younger, but Gambit is like, especially with his storyline and his whole, like, monsieur, like, ethos or whatever, is the Byronic hero.
Yeah.
Like, he's the bad guy that is just, like, begrudgingly good because it suits him, Like, he's definitely the one that's kind of like, I'm going to do what I want to do, and you're just lucky that it currently suits me to go along with whatever y'all are doing, Like, he's just the guy that's kind of, like, there, And I think that's what makes him interesting and makes him relatable, right? Because Storm is the kind of person that, like, is there for the morals of it because she's a good person, because it's the right thing to do, because she cares for Professor Xavier. And Gambit's like, could go start a brawl over a poker game, could go help the X-Men save the day. Depends on what I'm feeling.
I got a house over here with the X-Men. I got a room here, so I'm going to stay here for now.
Yeah.
How about you, Eric?
Gambit was a favorite. My family, we grew up playing a bunch of cards, so I got drawn to, his kinetic energy using playing cards as his main projectile. I don't know. I was really drawn to Cyclops, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because he was the perceived leader of the team. Maybe because he shot cool red, blast out of his eyes. But I was really drawn to Cyclops, and like they had the little. There was 3 main toys for like costumes. They had like a helmet and like a little glove you could put on. You had the Cyclops helmet. You had the Wolverine helmet with the claw glove, and then you had Magneto. And I wanted the Cyclops one so bad, and I got it, and it was such a letdown because I put it on my head and I pressed the button, and I'm like, that's it.
That's it. Oh, yeah.
So from that point,
right,
kind of like a little light bulb that blinks.
I moved over to Wolverine because not only did I get to wear the cool headgear,
right,
but I could slash things.
Yeah,
and that was cool. So
look, the dichotomy I feel like of Cyclops, like poor Scott, is, he has one of the coolest powers, but he's also the leader, right? And so, he can come off, I think, sometimes as like righteous. And I'm painting with like live action colors too, where like it's James Marsden, right, who plays Scott in the live action.
Yes,
I think so. Yeah,
and like the way he plays him, he does kind of come off as like, well, I'm right or whatever. But even in this, like one of the first episodes of this animated series, he's like, I don't apologize for command decisions. And I'm like, okay, Mr. Self-Righteous. Right. Like, so it's like the beauty of Cyclops is you're like, he's cool. He's got cool powers. He's the leader. But then because he's the leader, he has to be the one that's like, this is what we're doing. This is how it's going to be. And you're like, ugh, you're so like, ooh, Mr. Rules over here,
And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Rogue. I was drawn to her. What kind of accent was it?
Cajun?
Southern. No, Gambit was Cajun. She was
but hers comes off sometimes.
They feel like they come from the same place. Yeah.
Like hers comes. It's almost like a deep South Louisiana, Mississippi,
maybe
situation.
But just the fact that she could fly, the fact that she could absorb powers was really cool to me.
Because she also speaks French at one point. Yeah. So like
that makes sense.
Not just Gambit. I don't know.
Yeah. Kyle, what about you?
I think originally, and I remember even in the past like 10 years, Tim Hutchinson's like, who was your favorite character? And I was like, Morph was my favorite character because he could be anybody. Like,
Boo.
but yeah, that's the generic answer.
Lame.
If I had a wish, I'd wish for more wishes.
Yeah. Truthfully, like I really did like the character of Morph because of his like comedic sense about things, like where he was like committed to the team, but he also was just funny. But beyond that, I was totally like in love with Wolverine. Like if I could be this, I'd want to be that character. I'd want to be cool like that. And I think it's funny because we talked about Cyclops is the leader type role, and you have Wolverine that's like against him
He's
and
the
whatever.
rebel.
And it's completely like that with Ninja Turtles, where Leonardo is the leader.
Right.
Ralph.
And then Raph is the one with the attitude and like claw type weapons.
Right.
But it's funny where like I don't get that vibe in Ninja Turtles. Ninja
Right.
Turtles, I'm like, why you gotta be such a jerk? Like he's just trying to do the best for the team. Like why do
Right.
you have to come at him? But
Right.
again, like you say with Cyclops, he's like,
Right.
this is my role. This is what I do. Versus like Leonardo half the time was like, I didn't pick this position. I'm just trying to do the best I can for it. It's
Right.
like,
Well, Wolverine is the perfect like mix. I feel like it's because you have like Cyclops, who's like says he cares. Gambit says he doesn't care.
Yeah.
Wolverine says he doesn't care.
Totally cares.
Yeah.
Chaos neutral.
Yes. Exactly.
and you also get the vibe of like Scott's your typical like jock character. If you were to like categorize people, and then Wolverine's like the cool kid that
He's
gets
like
in
the
trouble.
the loner, the lone wolf,
Yep.
who wears the
Right.
leather jacket. And
right.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. I just think that was something cool to me too. And I feel like the fact that he wasn't overly powerful, like you come to know later, like he can heal and all these things. We didn't know that in the beginning. You just knew he had claws and was pretty fit and could
Right.
like jump around and smell things pretty good.
Yeah.
But for me, same way with the toys, they came out like I remember having. I still have him like the Wolverine with like the little claws that can come out.
Mm-hmm.
They gave Wolverine his own like Jeep-like vehicle that it's not in the cartoon. He drives a Jeep-like vehicle or like a car type thing. But in the toys, they made it like bright yellow and everything with looks like Wolverine.
Do you know how long it took me to figure out that Wolverine was an animal? That like
Yeah.
his whole theme.
It didn't click to me as a child.
I didn't even know
Hugh-
Wolverines were things.
Hugh Jackman didn't either. Whenever he got the role, he
Like a
thought it
honey
was
badger.
based off a wolf.
Yeah.
Or,
Right, yeah.
No, it's
Like
a Wolverine.
Wolverine.
You're from
So-
Australia. Hugh, come on.
Come on.
Speaking of Australia, like in the whole Pride, the X-Men, whatever thing, and even like Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends had some crossovers with X-Men, and they had an Australian voice actor that was very Australian. Like
Yes.
Wolverine was Australian for all
Right.
you knew.
Yes.
Right.
And it's funny because they didn't like his accent in Pride of the X-Men or whatever, so they didn't pass it or whatever. They didn't like him being Australian. Yet all of these years later with Logan, you have an Australian actor who comes
Right.
in with a fake English
Right.
accent
Yeah.
to do this character.
Yeah. Be Canadian.
Yeah.
So the next superlative I have is favorite episode story. I don't know if we know the series well enough to have a favorite episode, but I do want to point out that this, very similar to the Spider-Man animated series, set up long-term storytelling, which is
Sure.
it was very rare and maybe still rare for children's shows to have something that's a story that's long-term, longer than one episode. Like every episode for us as kids felt like it was a self-contained episode.
Right.
To the point where, like, if you were talking about the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the fact they had a 5-part episode to introduce the Green Ranger, that was a big deal. It wasn't just Monster of the Week, but
Right.
the X-Men, every episode was connected.
Right.
And so you got, it was like, you mentioned like this sounds like movies, featured films. It was the best of both worlds where you got to see it play out long form storytelling over several episodes.
Right.
Where you introduce villains such as Magneto, who was a villain, but also kind of a shades of gray. Like he has a good point. He's kind of like a Killmonger from Black Panther.
Right.
You introduce Mr. Sinister, who I still very vividly remember as one of my favorite villains of the series.
Right.
You introduce Apocalypse in his own storyline. You introduce the Phoenix Force. I mean, just so
Yeah.
many
We
great.
even had Medusa with Apocalypse, like,
Yes.
who has her own like wavery, like am I good, bad?
You
type
have
situation.
Days of Future Past, which is a 2-part episode.
Not Medusa, Mystique. Sorry,
Mystique, yeah, not
keep going.
Medusa.
Sorry.
You have all these things that's the thing that I don't necessarily have a favorite, but I
Right.
do vividly remember as a kid, like this was appointment television because it's like, well, I need to see what happens on the next
Well, and
episode.
honestly, like, it's worth mentioning that that's a gamble, right?
Oh,
Because
absolutely.
The reason that you don't create appointment television for kids is because you realize that they're not in charge of when and where they're watching TV for the most part.
Yeah.
You know, you can create serial television for adults because adults can say for the most part, every Tuesday at 8:00, I will be in front of my TV and I can make that decision. But kids can't control when they're allowed to have television time, when their family is doing things, when they might be. And so the idea that like you could miss something because you're not allowed to watch it or you're not given the opportunity at that time, you could easily be like, well, I'm not watching this.
Well, I think that was distinctly a 90s thing where, you know, the generation before us, they didn't dare, you know, talk back, you know, to their parents or didn't dare, like when grown-ups were speaking, you were silent.
Right.
But in the 90s, like, our favorite shows, our favorite toys, our favorite forms of entertainment empowered us to say, "Hey, go bug your parents. Go, you know, go
to McDonald's and
pay for the Happy Meal so you can get the toy. Go
get the cardboard cereal because it's got your favorite.
Everything was marketed to kids and it gave kids power. Like, mommy, I want this. Daddy, I want this. And to the point where our parents might have had some pushback, but they were like, well, we want to keep our kid happy. This is something that makes them happy. Now, I'm not sure every child was like that necessarily, but I do think that was a shift in the 90s where not necessarily kids ran the household and, you know, kids ran, you know, the home and the time frame or whatever, but they did have a little more say in, hey, I want to go home and watch Power Rangers at 4:30 or 4 o'clock. On Saturday morning, I want to wake up and watch this. Whereas the generation before was like, well, you know, get up and you go do your chores and do this and do this.
Well, and I also want to say that the federal something FTC
the FTC
no
FCC
anyway,
FCC, yes,
one of those government regulatory types.
Federal Communications.
I want to say in the early 90s there were some changes in regulation about how
to market.
You could market to kids. And so I think that some rules that had been in place were relaxed and corporations could start marketing directly to kids in certain ways. And so we were that first wave of children that were in front of a television that were being served ads that were made for us, not for our parents. And so then it was our job to then go to our parents and say, I want this.
Yep.
I want this Happy Meal with this toy. I want to watch this show. It's coming on this night at this time, you know. And that really changed the household dynamic because, you know, we could then say like, well, I want you to take me here and I want this thing, instead of commercials that went directly to parents saying like, get this for your kids or whatever. And so I think you did see that changeover in the 90s, and you could get away with, I mean, you look at like Hanna-Barbera cartoons, those were not serialized cartoons. Those did not have overarching
problem
stories.
Of the week. It's your basic sitcom telling.
Correct.
Problem of the week. Here's how it gets solved. Everyone's happy at the end of the 22 minutes.
Right.
Well, something like in the same way, keep going with that is if somebody got hurt on an episode of the X-Men, the next episode, they're still hurt.
Right.
Yes.
It's not where Ninja Turtles. Ninja Turtles changed as it got to its later seasons. It was a little bit different. Same way they started doing bigger arcs. But in the beginning, like, you could, you know, Raphael or somebody's like, whatever, messed up. Next episode, totally different. Never happened. Whatever.
Yeah, like, has it been 2 days? Has it been 2 weeks?
Sure.
Has it been a
But
year?
even in this one, like, Beast gets...
episodes?
He's in jail, and he's in jail the whole season.
Yeah.
Right.
Something funny about that, just to throw in there a quick fact with it, is the writers themselves had to pick these main people, and Marvel themselves were very much still involved too. All these different people in the room pushing about this until they got going and realized, like, okay, you guys know what you're doing. They, you know, pushed the main characters and everything else. Beast really wasn't supposed to hang around real long,
right?
Or even be included.
Get it? Hang
these
around.
people, yeah, it's true. But they said, you know, they made the decision to put Beast in jail so he would be there,
right?
So they could continue to have fun and use, like, they loved him as a character, so they wanted him there. So they put him in jail so that he would be there for the rest of the season, and going beyond that. But no, again, same way. Favorite arc episode, I feel like there's a lot of it. Something, I'm not going to say it's a favorite per se, but something that kind of goes in what you're talking about is, for all we knew after that first full episode, is Morph's dead.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He comes back in the second season under, I think,
under mind
Sinister.
control by Mr. Sinister. Yeah.
He comes back. He's got these like heavy, like looks like straight up drug user like guy He's got dark rings under his eyes, everything else. The toy you could buy of Morph had 3 different heads. It was Morph Happy, Morph Drug looking, same one as this one. And then there's like the I don't remember his name, but it's like the pterodactyl character or whatever.
Yeah.
But the same way, all of a sudden, I remember being attached to Morph, liking him. Oh man, he's dead. There's a big synopsis that keeps going with that. We're between, Scott or Cyclops and Wolverine about, leaving a friend behind, leaving whoever behind. Then this guy shows up, but now he's evil because he's under mind control. And so as a child, all of a sudden, this big story arc in a cartoon where somebody you thought was dead, all of a sudden now is back. He's evil. He's not here. You've got friends that are still trying to help him because we loved you. I should have never left you. And there's still so much going back and forth where this guy's still upset that they left him in the first season. So
absolutely,
for a kid's cartoon, that's pretty crazy.
It's pretty heavy.
Deep.
I will point out one more story arc before we move on. The Dark Phoenix story, which was done so well in the comics and it was done really well in this show. Mm-hmm. It was done so well that the movies are still trying to replicate it. They failed. They've had 2 shots at it and they failed both times.
I never even saw the latest one with Sophie Turner.
Sophie Turner, and they did their best, but it was not great. Like this was, in terms of viewing non-comic book or whatever, this is the standard for that storyline. Mm-hmm. And it's yet to be. The movies have had 2 opportunities to get there, and they've bombed it both times.
Right.
Which that's a story that honestly needs more than 2 hours, 2.5 hours to really permeate. This is what the 3rd season was. The whole season was about. It's centered around the Dark Phoenix storyline. So,
what's something important too with that is the head writer at least went back, got 30 years of Marvel comics and like hardcore read them all to figure out what this is of like X-Men comics anyway. Whenever the movies finally made it, the guy didn't go back and do all these comics. He went back and watched the full series of X-Men animated series to get an idea of this is who these people are. This is what's happening. So to think like what we're talking about now is a basis for these movies that came later, which of course now we go back and watch some of these movies compared to like the MCU we're used to now and like, oh, it's cheesy. Why are they all in black leather suits like everything else? But for us at that time period, it was awesome because it's the first time besides like Spider-Man, really for us that we're seeing our favorite people. But to know this series had that big of an effect where the guy went back, did his hardcore history to put a lot of this. Now, there were some changes and tweaks from like comics to cartoons, but a lot of some of the storylines from like major comic books were put into this. Mm-hmm. And that's where the knowledge of this came from. The same way the people that making the movies went back and watched this instead of reading a billion comic books. So
absolutely. Anything haven't aged well? What hasn't aged well? 20, 30 years later at this point.
Gambit's flirting for kids. It got a teeny bit inappropriate there, but I think it would go over most kids' heads.
Yeah.
I'm going to point out the animation in the 5th season was not up to par. Some of the production, some of the production in terms of airing episodes out of order, which was a big deal. Especially as kids you were entranced in watching this show, and then all of a sudden an episode's aired out of order. That obviously doesn't hold up well to me.
I don't know if the accents would come across well these days.
Come on, sugar.
They felt like caricatures in a sense. Like they're a little over the top. Gambit's has a reason, right? Like his character is based in a heavy history of the Bayou, but
French Cajun,
But I guess Rogue is from the South. Is there a reason she has such a heavy?
I know she has whenever they do like a flashback because they talk about her when she goes back. Where I think maybe and I could be combining this with the movies, but like where you at least get to see where she meets that boy that she talks about killing him for the first time. And it does seem like she's in a Southern type town. So
I don't.
I feel like us as Southerners kind of look at it and it's like, oh, that's way overboard. Versus some people probably look at it and like, of course that's what Southern people sound like.
Right. I mean, but some of it comes off as like comedic effect.
Sure.
Which if it's meant to be that, then it is funny. But if it's not meant to be funny, then it shouldn't be funny. Yeah. And it's a little too much. It's like giving, and they didn't do it in this series, but like if you're giving Wolverine an Australian accent and then she's Southern and he's Cajun and
She's
then I'm
from Caldecott County, Mississippi. That's
Oh,
a
Lord.
fictional Caldecott County, Mississippi.
okay.
I could see it if it's from Mississippi, I guess. And not hating on
Right.
Mississippi, but you do have a thicker accent.
Well,
like,
but then Professor Xavier does not have a British accent in the animated series.
I don't think so.
I know, right? And then also Storm, her whole background is like she's
African.
is the African continent, right? So like she has ties to Black Panther and his storyline. She doesn't have an African accent, which sounds like it might not play well depending on So then it's like, okay, well, we're going to give some characters an accent that goes with their background, and some characters we're not because it could get dicey. I just feel like maybe just lay off the accents.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't remember the full storyline, but I do know that's at some point we get introduced where they go back to her original tribe, like in Africa with everybody there. And I want to say there's a lot of pushback on her because she left. Like, and I don't remember 100%.
Right.
This is me trying to, 20 or more years from now, like trying to remember back. But I do remember there was a big part where they're back and where she grew up. You come to learn her history through everything. And you do have, I feel like there were, and again, I could be making this all up, but I'm pretty sure there was some pushback on her about like you left type deal.
Right.
So I don't know if where you left, your accent changes some versus they did actually have the culture shown on the show, for
Right.
that part. Right. But I don't remember enough to really say for sure one way or the other.
Right.
All right. What still holds up?
I think a lot of the storylines, because at least a lot of the theming, where you don't see it as much today, but I do feel like as kids, we saw these things, and as we grew up, we saw these things in real life. And so it was some things we could somewhat relate to, at least in some sense of understanding. I think the theming where they stuck with some real life type things, and they didn't just cheese it up the whole time. Like, it wasn't, sure, there's some cheesy moments, but where you can still go back and watch this and be like, this is a comic book show. It's not,
Right.
oh, this is, they've made tons of shows since that are kind of just like,
Right.
for a certain age, very cheesy, whatever. They enjoy it, let them have fun, versus how it can kind of hold up. Similar to how Batman animated series is.
I'm going to go ahead and mention the theme song. It's still
100%.
a banger.
Still fire.
Still holds up.
Total fire. Yeah. I feel like the anti-mutant rhetoric, as a foil for prejudice will never not be relevant.
Yeah.
I feel like they've done it on, they couldn't call them mutants because of the legal thing we talked about. So they called them, what did they call them on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.?
Inhumans.
Yeah.
Inhumans. They they did a storyline about Inhuman registries and stuff like that. And then when you get into, I just lost my train of thought. Inhumans, mutants. Oh, and then on Supergirl, on the DC side of things, they had a whole storyline about literal aliens, like how there were so many alien refugees that had been crash landing on Earth, like Supergirl and Superman. That they didn't want, Earth was closed to aliens.
Yeah.
And so I feel like those storylines are always important. And I don't think that necessarily penetrated my mind as a kid, but maybe there were some other like well-learned kids out there that they were picking up the metaphor that they were putting down.
I do think it teaches, and I'll be quick on this, I do think it teaches not to judge or
Right.
dislike someone based
Tolerance.
just because they're different.
Correct.
Well, in that quick video that I mentioned too, that's at the beginning of his VHS tape, Stan Lee talks about the mutants and talking about how they were able to represent a prejudice
Right.
through these cartoons to make sure people are aware. Even then, these are cartoon characters or comic book characters, but this prejudice still exists and it's
Right.
still wrong. Like, you need to be able to see that.
you look what Stan Lee did with Black Panther.
Sure.
Really anything he touched in, especially the 80s, moving it. He knew what he was doing.
Well, even too, and I'm not going to keep pushing with it, but like to see Magneto on this side of things, and then it represents other people in the culture of time as well. But you have prejudice happening, and where you have Magneto, that to certain people he's a horrible evil villain, but on the other side of it, especially later where you see it through Charles's eyes and they talk and they have that
Right.
relationship, they're both trying to accomplish a goal that's very similar, and they're both going about it in different ways.
Right.
And just how they handle different things. And I think that was a lot deeper than some of the other shows we watched growing up where Shredder's the bad guy or
Right.
whoever wants to conquer the world or whatever. Like, there's a lot more depth to it
I think
than there
once
was.
you especially moved into like Days of Future Past and the later live actions that had the, like Fassbender and McAvoy who were playing, before we knew them characters. I feel like that's one of the things I got really right was that relationship between the two of them.
Absolutely. Cool deal.
I agree.
All right, let's we got to get out of here because it's
Yeah,
late.
that's right.
We have any fun facts about the show that we want to share real quick? Rapid fire.
I have a fun fact about me as it
Nice.
relates to the X-Men. Have I ever told you guys about being drawn as Rogue?
No.
So when I worked at
This sounds like a social media post at some point.
it should be. When I worked at Books A Million in Wilson, there's a comic book artist that was living in Wilson at the time, and his name was Louis Small Jr., and he began illustrating comic books back with the Vampirella comics for Harris Comics in 1992, and he's done on and off work for like DC, Marvel, Valiant, Vertigo, and he freelances really.
Yeah.
And he would come into the cafe at Books A Million to just like draw. And Marvel would give their artist sketch cards. So it's like you're sketching out a character card and you could send them in. And if they like what you did, they might pick some of yours for like different runs and stuff. And he would use the people who worked at Books A Million as like facial sketch, and then he'd make them into the character.
That's awesome.
And he did a bunch of us, and I had come in for a Harry Potter day wearing my green Slytherin cloak, and he was like,
course.
"Do you mind if I draw you as Rogue?" And I was like, "No, oh my gosh."
No sugar.
So yeah, right, yeah. So this is me as Rogue.
Very
Oh,
nice.
that's awesome.
That
So
is
you
really
see
awesome.
like the gloves, and he put like a streak in my hair, and he had me like bring my cloak in and put my cloak up.
That's awesome.
So
That's pretty sweet. I
Yeah.
can't wait for all of you in
Yeah.
the
So I'll
radio
share it.
land
Yeah.
to see this.
when
It's
this
pretty awesome.
when this episode hits, I'll put it on the
First week in
the
April.
social media. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Cool deal. Any other fun facts that we want to share?
I'm good.
All right. Well, let's get out of here. Big thank you to Ricky Lyles for everything that he contributes to the podcast. We hope that you enjoyed our discussion on X-Men, the animated show, as much as we did. Go check it out on Disney Plus when they revive it next year. X-Men 97 coming to Disney Plus next year. And we hope that you're as pumped for the rest of this journey into the 90s as we are. Out of time on today's episode. Hit them with some last-minute plugs, Ashby.
I am Ashby Brame. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Ashby Gray, Gray. And you can listen to me rant about all the pop culture things that I'm currently watching and or looking forward to watching this year.
I'm Kyle Whitley, and I'm on Instagram on _live_bright_. I'm definitely excited for all of the new things that are coming out. I'm not going to throw too much out there, but if you watch the new trailer, at least the new trailer for us right now of Doctor Strange, there's definitely some hints of similar characters coming out.
We
and-
should tell him the truth.
Yes. And other things. I know they're redoing Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers, kind of, sort
Yeah.
of. I'm not 100% sure
Kinda,
how I feel
sorta.
about it. We'll see what happens.
Like the Chipmunks. I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah, it's kind of, I don't know. We'll see what happens there. But either way, check it out there. I'm sure I'll post some things about that.
And I'm Eric Creech. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at EricOMac15. And be sure to join us next week as we discuss Jurassic Park, 1993 Jurassic Park.
Don't move.
Don't move. Stay as cool, ladies and gentlemen, as the other side of the pillow. We'll catch you next time. See ya.
Bye.
What the what?